Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this program. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a Tuesday afternoon. It is the 11th of February. It is cold, and it appears that we are in the crosshairs of another storm. We are awaiting a storm. Looks like it'll be in our area tomorrow night through the night into Thursday morning. It's a little bit uncertain as to what we'll get, but there's a lot of snow and ice associated with this storm. It's the same one that's blasting its way through the south and has Atlanta and Birmingham and some of those places that would hit so badly a few weeks ago on high alert once again. The winter that will never end, apparently. It is a pleasure to be with you today on the Virtual Center, as it always is. I do encourage you to give us a call. We have a phone number, and if you use that number, we can get you on the air, and you can share your ideas and your thoughts on some of the issues that we've been dealing with, or related issues by all means. The more conversation we have, and the less monologue, I think the richer and more valuable the program. Our number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me on today's program or on other programs, by all means, feel free to do that. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, IEN, 906, all one word, at gmail.com. I did receive a couple of emails after yesterday's program, and one of them I specifically I responded with a reply email to the emailer Jack, and it was related to something that we were talking about yesterday, and it was the idea of stimulus response in the area of education. It was kind of the idea of behavior modification and behavior control by getting people to respond appropriately. And Jack raised the question, which I thought was really a good one, about online classes and the extent to which a large number of online learning opportunities seem to be based on that kind of stimulus response. What I mean is they tend very much to be information-based, and I spent, before I got into the experience myself of actually teaching an online class, I looked at a number of them. I've never taken one as a student, and that's a failing. I think it would have helped me had I been a student in one of these classes, but I never had the experience or the occasion to do that. But in the online classes that I looked at, it seemed to me that not all of them, but many of them tended to be information-based. And what I mean is, it was very, very much like the old-fashioned answer the questions at the end of the chapter in many of our earlier textbooks that we used to see in history and geography and political science and other areas as well. At least that was a sense I got. That the whole idea was that you cover a lot of information and then you ask some questions at the end which basically test recognition and recall of that particular information. And of course, you know, there's very little depth, very little way to measure any idea, any sense of understanding, any grasp of the analytical innuendos of information in terms of implications, in terms of tone, in terms of many things that kind of fall by the wayside in this kind of evaluation. And Jack raised the question about online instruction as being based to a large extent on the idea of stimulus response that we were talking about yesterday. And I really do think that there's something to be said for Jack's comment. I really do. I have to believe that we have, as online education has become more and more popular, and there's more and more of it, one would have to believe that the procedures or the mechanisms being used for online classes, methods of evaluation, have improved. They would almost have to. But I saw where it almost looked like an overnight job where suddenly institutions decided that one half of their classes in a particular discipline would be available online. And so they were cranking out online class after class after class in almost no time. And of course what that pretty much meant was that the evaluation was pretty weak. It was based mostly on recall and recognition of information, and with little depth and little pursuit of any understanding beyond the recall of the information itself. I don't know that Jack in his email intended to raise this, but in my response to him, I raised the question of a new phenomenon in higher education in addition to online classes. And these are the so-called MOOCs, M-O-O-C. It's an acronym for Massive Online College Classes. And some of the major universities in the country are offering these online classes. Most of them for no credit. And Jack raised the issue of that while many institutions don't give academic credit for these online classes, these so-called MOOCs, and the reason they're called massive online college classes is because many of them enroll hundreds, if not thousands, of students. And Jack pointed out that while most of them did not offer academic credit for completion of the course, many of them have begun issuing a certificate of completion, some recognition that the person who holds the certificate successfully completed the course from beginning to end and demonstrated some sort of positive outcome as a result of taking that course. And there's absolutely no question that over the last 18 months, I would say, maybe a little bit longer than that, the debate in higher education about MOOCs, massive online college classes, has been intense. And most of the attention focused on the issue of academic credit or the lack of academic credit. There was a tremendous fear that some of these major institutions like Stanford and Harvard and Yale that offered online classes and enrolled hundreds, indeed thousands of students, if they did start to award academic credit for them, and of course these classes are free for the most part. They don't carry any academic credit, but they are free. You do have to register, you do have to sign up, but there's no tuition charge. And of course, the goal is obvious. These institutions are making access to knowledge, are using technology, using the internet in order to make some of the most successful instructors in the world available to anybody who wants to experience these classes. The record so far is not astounding, because what the records seem to indicate, the numbers seem to indicate, that a vast percentage of people who sign up for these classes really don't complete them. Whether the workload becomes too intense, or they get sidetracked into other activities or whatever. The fact of the matter is that well under 50% of the people who register for these classes end up completing them. But on the other hand, that's still not bad, even if you only take a portion of the class. Just to experience some of the finest instructors and the finest lecturers in these various fields has value in and of itself, whether in fact they complete or not. Of course, the danger was many institutions were really worried, because if the Harvards and Stanfords and Yales and Princetons began to offer academic credit for these classes, then the concern was, why would students take our classes when they could take classes from these world-renowned authorities and experts from the very best? The fear was that these major institutions, by making online instruction available to the masses, if you will, would really cost institutions enrollment. And as far as I know, that's not happened. And part of the reason it's not happened is because of the issue of academic credit. As long as there's no academic credit awarded for these classes by the institution that offers the class, then the threat to the major institutions is minimal, and the result is that most of the people who sign up for and take these classes, even a portion of them, are doing it just for the experience and the exposure and the information itself. One other thing to keep in mind, and I don't know whether Jack is aware of this or not, I didn't put it in my email, but there is a private company called the Teaching Company that has put together a number of classes that they have available on both CDs and DVDs. And while these are for sale, and the price can be pretty steep, the Teaching Company periodically, 2 or 3 times a year, runs really substantial sales where they'll offer certain targeted classes for as much as 70 and 80% off the regular tuition cost. So, for example, you can buy a DVD of 18, 20, 30 half-hour lectures in a particular field for $29.95, $39.95, something like that, which is a real bargain. And the one thing the Teaching Company does is it goes out and finds the very best lecturers, so that not only are these classes substantive and well constructed, but the information, the material, is well delivered by people who have, many of them have won awards as being the most popular instructor in their institutions, or have won Teacher of the Year awards and various other things. In other words, the standard classes are being taught by the very best for sale. But again, the Teaching Company does not and cannot award academic credit. And institutions that I'm familiar with have been very, very careful to make it clear to students, we do not give credit for classes that you take on, in a program sponsored by the Teaching Company. But there's no question that we are just beginning to scratch the surface of the potential for educational reform of the internet and of technology. I would suggest to you that this very program, the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility, is indeed something quite new. It's not an academic course. There's no academic credit associated with it. But the mission of this program, what drives me, is the idea that there's a lot of valuable information on the Constitution and on issues related to the Constitution that citizens in this republic should know but don't. And as much as I can help to close that gap and make up for some of these deficiencies, that's what I've set out to do here at the Virtual Center. I'm looking at this primarily as the dissemination of information and pointing out some of the myths and some of the misappropriations of information and interpretations related to the Constitution and its meaning, its evolution, as the meaning of the Constitution has changed over the years by looking at some of the key Supreme Court decisions in certain areas. So again, I think that what we're seeing is a recognition that technology and the internet offers tremendous potential for the delivery of instruction. Now, how this is all going to shake out in the future in terms of institutions and regular classes in academic programs and academic credit for these classes and things like that, it's hard to tell at this point. But one of the things that it's very, very important to recognize is that institutions of higher education, at this point at least, have a monopoly on academic credit. In other words, you can have all the classes in the world that you want to offer, but until an institution is willing to award academic credit for them, then it becomes very, very difficult to encourage students to enroll in them because there's no payoff at the other end. So this idea of what are called MOOCs, M-O-O-Cs, massive online college classes, is a new phenomenon. And there have been articles, I've read articles about an instructor who teaches a class at Harvard which enrolls 1,400 students. It's from all over the world. And the lectures are available on the internet, and of course through chat rooms and various other devices, it's possible to interact with the instructor and interact with other students in the class. And very honestly, the class that we are contemplating doing here for high school students, we've now decided to postpone it until this coming fall, is going to be what I call, for lack of a better term, a hybrid class, in that a lot of it is going to be in-seat, traditional instruction of high school students delivered by a particular teacher on site at that school. But a significant portion of the class is going to be online. It's going to be interactive through Skype and various other means, and that way I will be able to work directly with each of the teachers each teacher who is teaching this course in their respective high schools. And so what we're envisioning is a coordinated effort that's going to reach students right in their own classrooms. And again, it's an innovative approach to the use of technology for purposes primarily of improving instruction and delivering instruction to more and more people. I think it's very significant. I want to thank Jack for the email and for the suggestion and the comments, and the fact that that he took such note of the stimulus response idea, which, if you remember yesterday, we looked at as part of the approach, the so-called behavioral psychology approach, that through the application of of appropriate stimuli, you can get the responses that you want. In other words, you not only can predict behavior, you can affect behavior. You can change behavior through a very, very intricate process of stimulus response. You basically know what particular stimulus is going to elicit a certain response. And that's what you want. So again, it's a way to test recall of information. It's a way to test recognition of information, but it in no way gives one the opportunity to assess understanding of information. It is not until a student is put into the situation of having to use information in order to do something with it that you can really gauge the level of understanding. In other words, how a student uses information gives one a clear picture of how well that particular student understands the information or the concept that has been presented. And so an instructor can really evaluate the success of his own instruction by looking at student performance and looking at the way that students are able to use or not able to use the information presented in a particular academic setting. So again, I think that's the missing element, and it's going to take a while before we are able to develop the ability to do that. So again, I want to thank Jack for the email and for the comment and the question, and the fact that it was a complimentary email, and I appreciate the compliment very much. The mere fact that Jack or anybody takes the time to send an email on something that's come up here at the virtual center, I take that as a vote of confidence in a sense. In other words, something has struck a chord, something has struck a nerve, and that's really what we're all about here at the virtual center. Again, phone number, area code 304-658-3333. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. I wanted to go back a little bit to where we were yesterday. It was really interesting. At the beginning of yesterday's program, I thought I knew where we were going. It turned out in 2 hours I couldn't get there. And I guess maybe that's my fault. But in the process of laying groundwork for an idea linked to another idea, which was going to take us to what I thought would be the focus of yesterday's program, turns out that it looks like it'll be the focus of today's program. But if I can, I'd like to go back and just quickly touch on a few of the things we did yesterday, because what we were talking about yesterday in the late 19th century, in and around the Industrial Revolution in America, was the establishment of a system of values and assumptions which are critically necessary in order to support and to drive free enterprise capitalism, which is at the heart of America's Industrial Revolution. And we talked about the extent to which values and beliefs came out of this period, especially with the application of science to industrialism itself. We talked a little bit about the application of electricity to transportation and communication. But we also talked about Charles Darwin and his research into ideas associated with what he calls evolution, and the extent to which Herbert Spencer and others who clearly had an agenda, a free enterprise agenda, were more than willing to take Darwin's research out of context, out of the realm of hard science, and transfer it into social science, into a mechanism or a set of assumptions and beliefs which seem to fit very, very well into the theories of free enterprise capitalism. And so that's really what we were talking about. In the course of that discussion, we looked at the birth of the social sciences: psychology, sociology, political science, geography, history, economics. And what we were talking about is the emergence within those disciplines, within those subject areas, of expertise, and the extent to which society began to tap into the expertise in these various areas of the social sciences in order to apply their knowledge and their expertise to the challenging problems which faced America in the late 19th century. Problems that either directly or indirectly were generated in large part by the Industrial Revolution, by the excesses of the Industrial Revolution. The tremendous growth of cities, the tremendous expansion of diversity within those cities, the problems of maintaining order and discipline within a society which was increasingly diverse, and the need to find strategies, find ways where people could live together in peace and harmony and function as a society, as a community. And the extent to which the teachings in psychology and in sociology find their way into the curriculum of our teachers' colleges, and the extent to which behavioral psychology seems to become the driving foundation for much of our teacher education. The idea of stimulus response, the idea of reward and punishment, the idea that right answers generate rewards, wrong answers generate punishment. One of the things that, and this is in the area of, this is an aside, but I think it's here, we might as well make mention of it. One of the things that an educational system based on these kinds of assumptions accomplishes is to turn out students who become very proficient in taking tests. And I think all of us would have to admit that whatever we think about the successes and or failures of our education system in today's world, the one thing we know is that our students, our kids, sure know how to take tests. They become master test takers. They become masters at guessing. In a multiple choice situation, they become masterful in eliminating the most obvious choices that most likely are not the right answer. In other words, many of our students are able to whittle down 4 and 5 choices to a question to 2 or 3 possibilities. In other words, they're very adept at eliminating 1 or 2 of the choices. So again, it's questionable as to how much our kids are learning, but the one thing they are learning is how to take tests and how to reduce the number of choices into something manageable and meaningful. And of course, the bottom line is random choice between A and B would suggest that if you don't know anything, the law of averages is going to make you right half the time if you can eliminate some of the extra choices. So again, I really think that's something we all need to realize, how polished many of our youngsters are at taking tests. They are masters. Of course, understanding the nature of education as an institution, they're also masters at being students. They know what works and what doesn't. How to impress instructors, how to feign interest in the particular material being taught in the classroom. Some of our teachers, some of our students are masters at being students and becoming test takers. Whether in fact they learn anything or not is another issue. But they know how the game is played. And of course, they're in that game year after year after year by law. And for the most part, they become very good at it. And so the irony is, by the time a student gets to college, one has to recognize the fact that that student has gone through a fairly rigorous experience of grades 1 through 12. They have had an infinite number of months and years and opportunities to learn how to be successful at being a student, how to play the game. And I would suggest to you, this in itself suggests a degree of understanding and intelligence that most people are unaware of, and most people are unwilling to give students for as much credit in many cases as they deserve. But anyway, that's kind of an aside. The one thing I wanted to return to from yesterday, however, was the difference between history and the other social sciences. Specifically, the fact that historical research, honest research, in pursuit of truth, people who are acquiring knowledge in their efforts to find the truth, is really what history is all about. What links all the other social sciences, with the exception of history, is that each of these, political science, economics, sociology, psychology, every one of those presumes to already have the truth. And the reason that they use the term social science is because these professionals see their role as conducting the kind of research necessary in order to make that science more predictable and more effective. But never does any of this research raise questions as to the validity or lack of validity of the assumptions which drive the particular enterprise, which drive that discipline. One is hard put to find a political scientist, a person who teaches and writes scholarly work on American government, for example, that doesn't believe that the American political process is the best of all other options. That's a closed book, so to speak. The economist who doesn't believe in the basic elements of free enterprise capitalism. They might differ, in other words, they might ideologically tend or lean toward being more conservative or more liberal, depending on how they define the proper role for government within an economy. So they differ in that respect. But they don't differ in the basic assumptions that free enterprise capitalism is the best economic system in the history of mankind in terms of generating the most good for the most people. There's absolutely no question that the standard of living generated for a significant number of people through free enterprise capitalism is unprecedented in the history of the world. And of course, the key is the strength of that system is to be defined in large part by its ability to work to the best interests of the majority of citizens. And when anything happens to interfere with that service to the citizenry at large, it becomes a direct threat to the system itself. I'm thinking specifically in my mind right now of the idea of inequality and the extent to which America is reeling under one of the most extreme periods of inequality in the nation's history, where so few have so much and so many have so little. And the system doesn't seem to be righting itself. If anything, it's getting worse. Principally because those who are doing the best in this particular system are using the clout that they have acquired to make sure that nothing comes along that changes the rules of the game. In other words, these people have a vested interest in locking in the ingredients of their own success. And so consequently, it becomes very difficult to speculate on the kinds of changes that would institute greater equality, if you will, within the society at large. There's no question that the degree of inequality that exists in the distribution of wealth and income in America today jeopardizes the very essence of this republic. Because if you do the analysis and you go all the way back through the founders and all the way back through the writings of John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and the Enlightenment thinkers, Newton and the rest of them, you begin to realize, as you peel away all the covers, the bottom line is what holds this system together, what makes this system work, is the idea that there is opportunity for everybody. If too many people begin to believe that they really don't have a chance, that the deck is stacked against them, and that the few people have, not only have access to most of the wealth and power, but they're also able to make sure that nothing changes to disturb that. Consequently, they become ideological dropouts. Why try? Why believe that there's a pot at the end of the rainbow, a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for me? if I work hard and I apply myself and I educate myself and I take advantage of the opportunities that come my way and all the rest of it, I too can be success. I too can achieve success in this society. It's that dream that brings people to this country, that has traditionally brought people to this country. And to be very, very blunt about it, the greater the inequality that exists in society, the more difficult it is for people to continue to believe in the dream. And when too many people lose faith in the dream, the system will crumble. The founders knew that. The brightest of the most successful, I'm thinking, in my mind, I'm thinking of the Andrew Carnegies and the John D. Rockefellers and the Pierpont Morgans and the Pierponts and the J.P. Morgans and all the rest of them. They knew this. They knew that their success was directly attributable to the nature of the community and the society, the system they lived in. And they were intelligent enough to realize that sustaining that system is the only way to sustain the opportunities which came their way. And so, in a sense, Carnegie, probably more than most, was very outspoken in his article that was written for the North American Review in 1889. He called it Wealth. When it was reprinted in a number of places, not only here but overseas, Great Britain as well, it was called Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth. Because in effect, what Carnegie was doing was giving advice to the successful and letting them know that they owed an obligation to the community. That ultimately what made this system work was the realization that the most successful in this system carried with their success a responsibility to give back to the community and make the same kinds of opportunities available for future generations as was made available for them. One of our listeners emailed me a link to an article about philanthropy in today's world and the extent to which the very wealthiest among us, the 50 wealthiest people in the nation and the world, are making commitments. I'm thinking of Bill Gates and the Waltons and the Koch brothers and others, have made commitments to give back. Warren Buffett, to give back a substantial portion of their wealth in philanthropy, which is kind of what Carnegie talked about. But the reality that this article points out, and I think it's worth all of us reflecting upon for a moment, the reality is that the kind of inequality that generates the very wealthiest people is not going to be affected in any way by philanthropy. In other words, the mere fact that the wealthy are giving back to the community does nothing to make changes in the operation of the system, which makes the inequality which allowed them to become so fabulously wealthy possible. In other words, nothing is happening to change the system in order to expand opportunity for other people. Philanthropy doesn't do anything to change the system. It does everything to cement it and to perpetuate it. And if you're going to do something about inequality, especially the degree of inequality that exists today, then something systemic is going to have to happen to the system itself. Just having the wealthiest people honor their commitment by giving back to society in the form of railroads and charities and mental hospitals and other very positive contributions to society, no question that these philanthropists make. But the fact of the matter is they are making their contribution to making society better for the people in it, but they aren't doing anything to enhance the opportunities available to the people in it. If that makes any sense. Very, very important concept. I'm thinking. I think I have a copy of the article here, but maybe I don't. I do. At the very end of the article, there's a comment by Robert Reich. And Robert Reich has serious questions about philanthropy in terms of whether, in fact, it's doing anything to change the system. So let me just read a couple of paragraphs at the end of this article. I want to thank the emailer for sending me this link. It's a very, very rich article. Robert Reich, former Secretary of Labor, doubts whether philanthropy by the rich can affect major changes in inequality. And anyway, he told me, China's dramatic rise is what's responsible for most of the world's reduction in poverty. So again, the estimates are, Bill Gates made the comment in his annual letter. He predicts that by 2035, there will be almost no poor countries left in the world. Gates says, countries will learn from their most productive neighbors and benefit from innovations like new vaccines, better seeds, and the digital revolution. Their labor forces, buoyed by expanded education, will attract new investments. And that's a quote from Bill Gates. So he's very optimistic about eliminating or making a major dent in poverty in the world through philanthropy. Robert Reich, former Secretary of Labor, doubts whether, in fact, philanthropy can cut it, can do this. He says that the improvement in poverty in the world is in large part related to China's dramatic rise, more than anything else. It's certainly admirable that wealthy individuals are willing to give away large chunks of their wealth, Reich said. But as in the late 19th century, when Carnegie, Rockefeller, and others did so, these philanthropic actions are small potatoes relative to the large and growing problems faced by the poor and lower middle class. In other words, as much money as philanthropists are putting back into the system, as it were, they're not really doing anything to affect the people at the bottom. Reich goes on. The real way to address poverty, he said, is through a democratic system that keeps tabs on the excesses of capitalism, yet harnesses the engine of the economy to help improve the lives of the least well-off, pays attention to issues that are important to the poor and middle classes, and works to prevent the accumulation of power in the hands of the few. In other words, Reich's formula is, until we find a way to stem the growth of inequality in our society, we will not do anything materially successful in order to alleviate real poverty. As the great Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis once said, Wright reported, we can have great wealth in the hands of a relative few, or we can have a democracy, but we can't have both. I think philanthropists believe we can. I think it's a question that all of us need to reflect upon. Anyway, the issue that I'd like to raise as we move toward the end of our first hour today and into our second hour is this issue of values and where they come from. I mentioned history during the late 19th century as being different than the others. I would suggest, however, that historians are not and never were immune from trying to find ways to explain the present with the past. That is one of the major values of studying history, is to learn from the past in order to improve the present. In the late 19th century, historians became very, very interested in our political system, in our economic system, in the growth of our cities, in the emergence of industrialism, in the improved quality of life and standard of living that industrialism made possible by making goods that used to be reserved only for the wealthy available to the masses at reasonable prices. Historians were in search always of ingredients or elements in America's past that help to explain its present. In 1893, at a professional conference of historians, Organization of American Historians, a paper was delivered by a historian, an American historian named Frederick Jackson Turner. Frederick Jackson Turner was a history professor at the University of Wisconsin. And at the 1893 session of the American Historical Association, Turner presented a paper that was going to have a profound impact on the way future generations looked at America's past as well as its future. The title of Turner's paper was "The Significance of the Frontier in American History." The significance of the frontier in American history. Turner's paper made the argument that much of the value system that we associate with America in the late 19th century, many of the values that we place a premium upon are directly attributable to America's past history of civilizing the wilderness, of mastering the frontier. And what stimulated his paper in 1893 was the following report from the superintendent of the census in 1890. Many of us will remember that in the Constitution of the United States is a provision that every 10 years Congress will undertake a census. Every 10 years we will count people. And based on that census every 10 years, representation in Congress will be readjusted according to the movements in population. In other words, it could happen that because a particular state loses population and another state gains population, that in the census, which reflects that, it may be necessary to take one representative away from a state and give it to another state that has picked up a significant amount of population. In other words, by counting people every 10 years in the census, and I think if you think about it, you can remember when you get that humongous document in the mail, if you happen to be the lucky ones that doesn't get the short version but gets the long one, the census, and a lot of people are so afraid that they're going to compromise their privacy by answering those questions. It answers questions like how many people are living in your house, how many people work, how many people would be labeled disabled, how many people are going to school, how many people are retired, how many is there anybody in your household who's on disability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And many people become very, very uncomfortable with those kinds of questions, and they're very, very protective of what they believe to be their privacy. Given some of the issues that we've looked at here in previous programs, it's unclear how much of that privacy is left anyway, but some people are really protective of it. But anyway, the provision for the census every 10 years is written into the Constitution of the United States. In 1893, Turner reported that the superintendent of the census in 1890, which was the census taken 3 years before he presented his paper, there appears in that census of 1890 these words, quote, "Up to and including 1880, the country had a frontier of settlement. But at present, the unsettled area has been so broken into by isolated bodies of settlement that there can hardly be said to be a frontier line. In the discussion of the frontier's extent, its westward movement, it cannot therefore any longer have a place in the census reports." Unquote. Translation: the census of 1890 effectively reports that as of 1890, there is no longer a frontier in the continental United States, that for all practical purposes, the frontier has been conquered, and there is no more. Turner's paper raises the question as to what the end of the frontier means for America, for its education system, for its value system. And then he proceeds in his paper to address the elements of what constitutes an American. What is so unique about being an American? And Turner relates that directly to the frontier experience and constantly keeps returning to the opening statement that there is no longer a frontier. What's going to happen to this value and that value and the other values now that there is no longer a frontier to help us develop and perpetuate these values? Is America as we know it? Is the American as we know him or her a thing of the past? Is America on the edge of major change now that we no longer have the frontier to help us fashion our value system? It is one of the major pieces of historical research and speculation ever written in American history. It has been the subject of innumerable books and innumerable studies. Some people find it a positive, some people find it a negative, some people, are worried about it, some people aren't. The point is, we were talking yesterday here at the Virtual Center about this mentality of anti-regulation, anti-government that seems to be so firmly entrenched in the West Virginia psyche, in the West Virginia mindset. And that led us into a discussion of where many of these values came from and how they emerged and how they developed and how they became established in American society. Frederick Jackson Turner is suggesting a major answer to the story as to where our value system comes from. I'd like to take some time here in our next hour and examine Turner's Frontier Thesis, not only for what it says, but potentially for what it means. First, however, we're going to pause and take a break. It's 1 minute after the top of the hour. Let's pause and take a 5-minute break. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. After a brief break, we'll be right back. Please stay with us. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the second hour of today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien, and it is a pleasure to have you join us today. If you are just joining us, welcome. If you've been with us through our first hour, thank you so very much for staying with us. We've been looking at the origin of American values. We started, if you remember yesterday, with the search of values which really drive the Industrial Revolution and free enterprise capitalism in America. And much of that comes in the late 19th century and is tied up directly or indirectly with the research of Charles Darwin and the idea of evolution, and the extent to which free enterprise capitalist society mirrors nature itself in terms of change and evolution, and Darwin's finding of the existence of struggle and survival, struggle for existence and survival of the fittest in nature. And of course, Herbert Spencer and others take that out of the realm of hard science, transfer it to society, and to begin to draw some very, very explosive conclusions, if you will, about what it means in a society when we have large and growing numbers of poor people. And whether, in fact, to aid these people with something that we call today a safety net is indeed a service to society or a detriment to society. If you buy into Darwin's theory of evolution, then in a sense, as Spencer argued, what we would effectively be doing by interfering in the natural process would be to keep the unfit alive. I mean, this is about the most blunt and hardest way to look at this, but this is really what it is. So, in a sense, what we've been looking at are the origins of this distrust of government, this distrust of government regulation, and the idea that free enterprise capitalism and corporate America must be allowed the maximum amount of freedom in order to compete effectively in this struggle for existence, which we call today the global economy. Very, very interesting analogies from America's past. And right at the end of our first hour, we were introduced to the theory posed in 1893 by a historian from the University of Wisconsin named Frederick Jackson Turner, and his very famous paper delivered at the organization, at the American Historical Association in its 1893 conference, entitled The Significance of the Frontier in American History. We would love to hear from you. If you have a reaction to any of this, something to add, something to question, by all means, feel free to do it. Again, this is, if there are things that you could get more from these presentations, if there were things that I could do to make these programs more meaningful to you, I want to hear about them. And so I encourage you to avail yourself of the means of communicating with us. We have a phone number. The area code is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. If you'd like to communicate individually directly with me via email, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. To go back to Turner's paper and his opening paragraph, Turner says the following. In a recent bulletin of the Superintendent of the Census for 1890 appear these significant words, quote, up to and including 1880, the country had a frontier of settlement. But at present, the unsettled area has been so broken into by isolated bodies of settlement that they can hardly be said to be a frontier line. In the discussion of the frontier's extent, its westward movement, it cannot therefore any longer have a place in the census reports. Translation: as of 1890, the U.S. Census reports that for all practical purposes, the frontier that was so much a part of America for so long is no more. Turner goes on. This brief official statement marks the closing of a great historic movement. Up to our own day, American history has been in a large degree the history of the colonization of the Great West. The existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development. So basically, the question that Turner is raising is, with the closing of the frontier, what will this mean in terms of America's future development? Since so much of what America has become as of the late 19th century is due directly to the existence of the frontier experience. The extent to which America has been the process of colonizing the Great West. Turner goes into the nature of America's institutions and says the following. The peculiarity of American institutions is the fact that they have been compelled to adapt themselves to the changes of an expanding people, to the changes involving crossing a continent, in winning a wilderness, and in developing at each area of this progress out of the primitive economic and political conditions of the frontier into the complexity of city life. What Turner is saying is that what makes American institutions unique, peculiar, is that all of these institutions have developed in the context of an expanding people, a movement west. All of American institutions have developed within the context of a people moving across the continent and in the process conquering the wilderness. And very interesting, and in developing at each area of this progress out of the primitive economic and political conditions of the frontier into the complexity of city life. In other words, over and over and over again, American history has renewed itself, has gone through the same process of the most primitive existence to the contemporary urban existence of late 19th century America. So it's not that we went through this process just once, but with the movement of the frontier west, each time we take on the wilderness again, it's necessary to go through the same development process over again and over again and over again. Consequently, America is constantly renewing itself, and its institutions are developing with this important characteristic, that all of them develop within the context of this process of conquering the wilderness. Turner said all peoples show development. In the case of most nations, however, the development has occurred in a limited area. And if the nation has expanded, it has met other growing peoples whom it has conquered. In the past, most nations have expanded, but the expansion was usually the result of war, conquest. America's experience is totally unique, is quite different from that. He says, but in the case of the United States, we have a different phenomenon. In the United States, we have the familiar phenomenon of the evolution of institutions in a limited area, the progress from primitive society up to manufacturing civilization. But we have, in addition to this, a recurrence of the process of evolution in each Western area reached in the process of expansion. In other words, civilization is emerging from the wilderness again and again and again and again. So we're not just conquering a people one time, and that's the extent of it. In the case of the United States, this renewal has been constant, recurring, over and over again. But, he says, we have, in addition to this, a recurrence of the process of evolution in each Western area reached in the process of expansion. Thus, American development has exhibited not merely advance along a single line, but a return to primitive conditions on a continually advancing frontier line and a new development for that area. So in other words, it's not just one frontier line. It has continually been beginning over again on the frontier. This perennial rebirth, he says, this fluidity of American life, this expansion westward with its new opportunities, its continuous touch with the simplicity of primitive society, furnish the forces dominating American character. The true point of view in the history of this nation is not the Atlantic coast, it is the Great West. I think we would be remiss if we didn't spend a moment at least on Turner's mention of the simplicity of primitive society, Native Americans. Jefferson was one who believed that there was something noble about the Indian, about Native Americans. He believed that in the process of development, we could witness the evolution of civilization itself within the civilizing of Native Americans. And translating that into the frontier idea, Jefferson was one of those who believed that the entire American character itself was defined by this frontier experience, by this experience of beginning at the most primitive levels and moving into the urban industrial manufacturing definition of civilization today. So Turner says, advisedly, this perennial rebirth, this fluidity of American life, this expansion westward with its new opportunities, its continuous touch with the simplicity of primitive society, furnished the forces dominating American character. For a moment, I ask that you reflect on what you believe to be the principal values necessary for survival on the frontier. In other words, imagine in your own mind a frontier environment. Think back to Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone. Think back to Hawkeye and the Last of the Mohegans. Think about Little House on the Prairie on television. What is there about the frontier experience that defines its own definition of character? What values, what attributes does survival on the frontier require? When I threw this question out yesterday to a class, the first answer I got from one of the students was self-reliance. Absolutely no question that that's a key part of the American character. The idea that you're out there all by yourself. There's nobody to rely on. There's nobody else to depend on. There's no government programs. There are no food stamp programs. There are no hospitals. There are no schools. There are no factories that manufacture knives and bows and arrows and all the rest of it. In other words, you have to basically develop for yourself what you feel you need to survive. You need to be responsible for growing your own food. You need to be responsible for downing trees, planting in the soil, raising livestock, protecting yourself from intruders, marauding Indians, and all the rest of it. So there's no question that self-reliance, independence, freedom, the necessity to work, reliance on one's own ingenuity, creativity, the ability to size up threats and find a way to deal with them positively, reliance on family, reverence for place, appreciating the place you are in, that through the process of your sweat, your hard work, your labor, this place becomes your place. Private property. The sanctity of private property. The tremendous importance of self-reliance and freedom and independence and toughness and physical and mental strength. Reliance on family. All of those things that we value as Americans become primary values associated with the frontier experience. The fact of the matter is, one of the things that we've tried to do in American history, throughout American history, is to recreate those experiences in order to generate the values. In other words, we've been met with the challenge of trying to recreate enough of the frontier experience that the values that come from it will be recognized and developed. And that becomes a key part of our whole education system, is to develop these ideas of the value of individual freedom, liberty, fresh air, appreciation for the environment, appreciation for life, appreciation of the Creator, on and on and on. I would suggest to you that we would be hard put to identify any significant part of America's value system and not find ways that it connects to the ideal of what we call the frontier. Back to Turner. The frontier is the line of most rapid and effective Americanization. He's defining the frontier. The frontier is the line of most rapid and effective Americanization. The frontier is the place where the process of Americanization happens. And as it happens, the frontier moves west. And consequently, Americanization further west will require the same kind of experiences over and over again. The wilderness masters the colonist, says Turner. The wilderness masters the colonist. It finds him a European in dress, industries, tools, modes of travel, and thought. It takes him from the railroad car and puts him in the birch canoe. The wilderness forces people to go back to the very beginning, to the basic, most simplistic element of existence, forcing you to go back from the railroad car to the birch canoe. It strips off the garment of civilization and arrays him in the hunting shirt and the moccasin. In other words, in order to survive on the frontier, you have to become a frontiersman. The skills that you bring to the frontier are of no use to you. The frontier generates its own agenda of priority skills, and you need to master them in order to master and survive on the frontier. It puts him in the log cabin of the Cherokee and the Iroquois and runs an Indian palisade around him. In other words, you must become Indian-like in order to master the frontier as the Native American has done. Before long, he has gone to planting Indian corn and plowing with a sharp stick. He shouts the war cry and takes the scalp in orthodox Indian fashion. Your success on the frontier is determined by how successfully you are able to embrace the frontier and its challenges. If you can adapt, if you can adjust, then you can develop the skills and the attributes which will enable you to survive. If you cannot adapt, you will not survive. Consequently, the frontier is having this incredible educational, renewing experience on every person who comes to it. It requires that they revert to the very beginning of civilization and move up through it. What a fantastic concept, if you think about it. In short, Turner says, at the frontier, the environment is at first too strong for the man. He must accept the conditions which it furnishes or perish. And so he fits himself into the Indian clearings and follows the Indian trails. Little by little, he transforms the wilderness. But the outcome is not the old Europe. The fact is that here is a new product that is American. By going through the process that the frontier demands of you, you become a unique character. You become something different than anybody in any other part of the world. You become unique because you have been required to go through the process of the evolution of civilization itself within you. You have been required to go all the way back to the beginning and work your way back to the present. But when you get back to the present, it's not the present that you came to the frontier with. You're a different person as a result. You are an American. At first, the frontier was the Atlantic coast. It was the frontier of Europe in a very real sense. Moving westward, the frontier became more and more American. Each frontier leaves its traces behind it, and when it becomes a settled area, the region still partakes of frontier characteristics. Thus, the advance of the frontier has meant a steady movement away from the influence of Europe, a steady growth of independence along American lines. And to study this advance, the men who grew up under these conditions and the political, economic, and social results of it is to study the really American part of our history. What Turner has succeeded in doing in this essay, in this paper, is to basically suggest what he believes is the major factor in what makes an American different and unique from anybody else in the face of the earth. Now, of course, the question here is, to what extent First of all, to what extent does this make sense to you? But I ask you to reflect upon it. Reflect upon it hard. Does this, in part at least, help to explain some of what some people rather loosely call American exceptionalism? Are we really a totally unique people from anybody else on the face of the earth because of the experiences every one of us has been required to go through in order to conquer the frontier? Has the frontier meant that much to what we are and what we have become as individuals and as a society, as a nation? How much of the value system that we associate with the frontier also happens to define America's role in its relationship with other nations in the world? To what extent do we sit down at the negotiating table in international affairs in buckskins, if you know what I mean? To what extent do we bring this sense of self-reliance and independence and strength and a sense of certainty? The idea that we know what we know and we know it well. Does this imply a kind of swagger, a kind of arrogance, in a sense, a kind of elitism? Once we think about the frontier and the values that we directly associate with the frontier, and once we are comfortable that we can claim them because we possess them and they are us, we are the sum total of that value system. Does that make us superior to those who don't have it, or just different? In the late 19th century, one of the social sciences that we talked about yesterday, sociology, came up with a term that many of us have heard of. We probably haven't heard it for a long time, but I think most of us will remember it from our grade school days. The term I'm thinking of is melting pot. This is the period when the idea of America as a melting pot became fashionable. It was the answer from the experts, sociologists, as to what made living in America unique from living anywhere else. In the late 19th and early 20th century, for obvious reasons, the Industrial Revolution, people from all over the world were flocking to the United States because it was possible to come to the New World and get a job and partake of something called the American dream. This was the one nation of all the nations in the world, theoretically, where it was possible to come here with nothing, with a chance to become everything. This was the place where opportunity was real. This was the place where everybody had a chance. This was the place where nobody was locked into a particular status or a particular situation. This was the place that was defined by Horatio Alger and the idea of rags to riches, the stories of Horatio Alger on working hard and getting your just reward. Consequently, millions of immigrants from all over the world flocked into America's cities. Consequently, urban America in the late 19th century becomes so volatile that it's on the edge of explosion. Our cities overnight become overpopulated. There is inadequate housing. There is inadequate sanitation. There are serious health problems. There are serious crime problems. There are real, very serious transportation problems. There better be jobs for these people, because if you bring all of these people over here and there aren't any jobs, you got a problem. So to America they come. People whose hair color is different. People whose eye color is different. People whose religion is different. People whose language is different. People whose ethnic background is different. People whose skin is a different color. All of them in pursuit of the same thing in the same place. America's cities become time bombs. How do you make the kind of changes, the kind of adjustments in society that make it possible for a diverse population like this to live together in peace and harmony and get along without killing each other? What kind of changes do you need to make in order to turn this hodgepodge into a living, breathing, functioning community? The answer? What we have to do is find a way to take all of these differences, put them together and stir them up, and create something totally new called an American. In effect, America itself becomes a melting pot. Becomes a place where people with differences emerge as people with more in common than there is that divide them. And so the values that Turner recognized as being directly attributable to the history and the existence of the frontier become the values, become the definition of what being an American is about. And the key is to make sure that every immigrant, every newcomer to our shores goes through this melting pot experience. And the way to do it is through the schools. And the way to guarantee it is to pass laws requiring all children to attend school for a certain period of time. And then, as we talked about yesterday, one of the major educational reforms of this period is the introduction of the American high school as a legal requirement. As state after state begins to adopt legislation requiring all children to stay in school until they reach a certain age. 16 years old tends to be the age most commonly sought after. So what you are doing is guaranteeing that all of your children, no matter where they are from, will go through this melting pot experience and will emerge from the melting pot as a totally different individual called the American. All of this directly attributable to the frontier experience. Turner goes on, and this is the last paragraph. Since the days when the fleet of Columbus sailed into the waters of the New World, America has been another name for opportunity. And the people of the United States have taken their tone from the incessant expansion which has not only been open, but has even been forced upon them. Movement has been its dominant fact, and unless this training has no effect upon a people, the American energy will continually demand a wider field for its existence. The key to American peace, harmony, and security is freedom. The freedom to move. The idea of what sociologists call a safety valve. If you put citizens into this kind of an environment and don't give them the opportunity to move from place to place in order to pursue success, then your cities will explode. The movement west, the frontier itself, becomes for American society what sociologists call a safety valve. If you think of a boiler and you begin to heat up the water, the steam in the boiler, if you don't have a safety valve to release the extra pressure, the boiler eventually will explode. So also will a city devoid of opportunity for its people. So consequently, the availability of the West, the ability of people to move west, is, according to Turner, the reason why America never experiences anything like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, the violence and death and bloodshed associated with the kinds of revolutions and explosions that happen in other societies throughout the world. The reason it's never happened here, Turner believes, is because there has always been a West. There was always the opportunity to pick up and move on and try again. The availability of opportunity is a key to the peace and security of this society. It is no accident that when Thomas Jefferson was able to purchase Louisiana from the French, from Napoleon, in 1803, he was able to call Louisiana Empire for Liberty. He believed that he had secured enough property, enough land, to make opportunity available for generations upon generation of Americans. He felt that the purchase of Louisiana guaranteed the peace and security and stability of the United States of America for as long into the future as you could speculate. Because there was always opportunity for people to pick up and start again. And so the West, the frontier, becomes, in American history, a safety valve, a way to eliminate and reduce social pressure. Pressures created by unemployment and the loss of jobs. Think what would happen if you had all of these people in all of these overcrowded cities and no work, and no opportunity for people to move anywhere else. You leave people no choice except to turn to their own, to look at their own government, to turn on government itself, because they have no other hope, no other way out. In order to guarantee the stability of society, you have got to provide people a way out, an opportunity for another chance. And Jefferson believed that Louisiana did that. So it was not a loose choice of words when he referred to the Louisiana Purchase as Empire for Liberty. Liberty, individual liberty, was meaningless without opportunity. What good did it do anybody to be free if you couldn't do anything with that freedom? Movement, Turner says, has been the frontier's dominant fact. And unless this training has no effect upon a people, the American energy will continually demand a wider field for its existence. A key characteristic of Americans is that we are a mobile people. We can move. Consequently, we always demand a wider field. We have to have more and more and more. Now he's addressing himself to the reality of this 1890 census report. But never again, he says, will such gifts of free land offer themselves. For a moment, with the closing of the frontier, the bonds of custom are broken. And yet, the stubborn American environment is there, with its imperious summons to accept its conditions. The inherited ways of doing things are also there. Throughout American history, in spite of environment and in spite of custom, each frontier did indeed furnish a new field of opportunity, a gate of escape from the bondage of the past, and freshness and confidence and scorn of older society, impatience of its restraints and its ideas, and indifference to its lessons have accompanied the frontier. What the Mediterranean Sea was to the Greeks, breaking the bonds of custom, offering new experiences, calling out new institutions and activities, that and more, the ever-retreating frontier has been to the United States. And now, 4 centuries from the discovery of America, at the end of 100 years of life under the Constitution, the frontier is gone. And with its going has closed the first period of American history. So the question, as we approach the end of our program, we have 5 minutes left, the question that we are confronted with, that Turner is confronted with, what is going to happen to America now that there is no more frontier? I would suggest to you that the answer, in part, lies in the Industrial Revolution. Because industrialism makes it possible for people to have good access to goods and services that they never dreamed of before, average people. But the reality is that the applications of science to industry, to manufacturing, create a real dilemma for America at the end of the 19th century. Industrialism has made it possible for the American manufacturing capability to outstrip its own ability to consume. We have reached the point where industry can produce more than the American people can use. Consequently, factories will close. Warehouses will pile up with unsold goods. Layoffs will occur. Unemployment will result. Crime and disenchantment will surely follow, unless we can find a way to continually grow the market for American manufactured goods. And the potential for that market is overseas. And so the irony is that free trade, free markets, open access to oceans of the world becomes the Industrial Revolution substitute for the frontier. To reduce this to simple terms, if you work in a factory that makes refrigerators, at some point, everybody's going to have a refrigerator, unless you can find a way to sell refrigerators overseas. What that means is that the foreign policy of your government is tied directly to the quality of life of your people. Successful foreign policy requires a government that is constantly finding new markets and new opportunities for American manufacturing. Consequently, America becomes a world power because of its industrial and agricultural capabilities. And the whole history of American foreign policy begins to take on a new wrinkle with industrialism. We had foreign policy before. We had the Monroe Doctrine. We had all of that stuff. But the Industrial Revolution changes the game because it makes foreign policy absolutely critical to an expanding sense of opportunity in America. The expansive nature of the frontier is replaced by the creation of jobs. And it is absolutely vital that a successful foreign policy create the need for more jobs and more opportunities for Americans. Consequently, We have to become an international force, an international power. It's in us. It's in our frontier experience. It's in our genes as a people. What a story Frederick Jackson Turner has laid out for us in 1893. The questions and insights it raises are infinite. We have reached the top of our second hour, and it's time to say goodbye and ask you to join us again tomorrow. We'll be back at our regular time tomorrow, 1 hour later, 4 to 6, for the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. For Bob Kincaid and the folks at the Head On Radio Network, I'm Bill O'Brien. Thank you so much for listening. Be safe and have a wonderful evening.